So our final interview of the day involves our second speaker. We've heard earlier from Stephen Kinnock, and now we're going to hear from the Conservative side. And to speak with her interviewee, and I'll let her introduce him, will be Joanne Nadler. Joanne's a political journalist and author, former BBC programme maker and reporter, she told me, although I see she's left off her really key role as URY, University of Radio York producer when we were both at university together. She previously worked for the Conservative Party in the 1990s and served as a councillor in Wandsworth to 2014, where she chaired the Education Standards Committee. And she spent lockdown working with the Centre for Social Justice on a project with Sajid Javid, and is currently researching a project on the politicisation of schools. And to be in conversation with her will be Danny Kruger. So, Joanne, thank you very much. Danny, thank you very much. Come take your seats. I hope you're mic'd up.
Thank you for your introduction, Ben. It sounded as though I was the main attraction here, but absolutely not. I think he left it to me to introduce Danny and to explain why he's so central to this agenda. Danny Kruger is the recently appointed PPS to Michael Gove, and as such is very much a lightning rod to the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, as it's now known. Now, he's only been an MP since 2019, but he's very much a seasoned Westminster politico, if I can put it that way. And he was a speechwriter to David Cameron. He has worked in think tanks. He's been a leader writer. But I think most importantly, in terms of this session, he stood aside from all of that to actually practice what he preaches, and around about 10 years ago set up a charity to help prisoners with rehabilitation, which he then left Westminster to run it full time. Danny is very much considered to be sort of a big thinker, a person of ideas. He's a man of faith whose considered opinions challenge the secular consensus. And he's recently published this very hefty and important tome, Levelling Up Our Communities, and he's also established something called the New Social Covenant Unit. And I think that's probably where I'd like to start, Danny. The New Social Covenant, what's different in your mind between what we might call a social covenant and a social contract?
Thank you, Joanne, and everyone, and to Radix Big Tent for having me. Enjoyed this journey of this outfit since George started some years ago. So the New Social Covenant is the term that Miriam Cates and I, so Miriam's another new MP elected in 2019, she represents a seat in Yorkshire, and we set this little outfit up which dedicated to the idea that what really makes us safe, happy and free as individuals is not just the freedoms and the liberties we enjoy, but the relationships and the memberships that we're part of. And what we really need to be safe, happy and free are strong families, strong communities and a strong nation. And that our individual identity is essentially relational. And I think as a civilization, and my party I think has been a part of this, in the lead in some respects, in this, our civilization has adopted an idea of human flourishing that is largely individualistic. We've developed a narrative around liberation, and that is necessary. I mean, what would we do without freedom? There can be no true flourishing without it. But really what we need is to belong to nourishing institutions that tell us who we are, and give us agency and a sense of belonging. So what we're about, and I'll say it quickly, is we're not a think tank. There's loads of brilliant think tanks out there. What we do is try and support ideas from within Parliament and outside that strengthen families, communities and the nation, and it's cross-party. I mean, we're 2 Tory MPs who set it up, but we work with anybody, and we promote what people are doing in Parliament and outside, to try and shift the narrative a bit away from this quite individualistic mindset and towards this more relational and community-based idea.
So, levelling up and regeneration, there's been, I think, quite understandably, a lot of scepticism about the phrase levelling up and whether or not the government is sincere, whether or not the government can actually deliver on it. That seems to be partly because, for as long as I can remember, something approximating to the idea of levelling up has been centre stage politically. I mean, going back to John Major, there was sort of the idea of the classless society, and then we had this whole adventure into communitarianism, and of course the big society, which you were quite involved with, I believe. So what would you say is different in the approach of the government now, and how do you think you can reassure people that actually there is going to be some delivery now, and it isn't just a sort of slightly fanciful idea?
Well, you're right that it's an old priority, I mean, quite rightly. I mean, we are the most spatially unequal country in the developed world, and we have been for generations, I mean, literally generations. If you look back in the 1930s and the political debates then, they were talking about the distressed areas. And frankly, those are the same places if you look on the map. They're the places that were essentially left behind by deindustrialization. And we have tried, we, the political class, have tried all this time and over all those decades to do something about it. Meanwhile, of course, problems have been exacerbated by globalization. So you're right, this is not a new priority. And you're also right that Conservatives since the 90s, well, actually since the 80s with Michael Heseltine working on behalf of Margaret Thatcher in Liverpool and elsewhere, this has been a political priority. And throughout the Blair years it was as well, and significant amounts of money were spent on initiatives to try and address the challenges of deindustrialised towns. What's different this time? Well, partly it is, I mean, if you doubt our sincerity, then please don't, Joanne. I mean, you know, our whole political, you know, if you think purely about that politicians are cynical, which is, you know, a legitimate assumption, even if we were purely cynical, this would be our imperative. This is the majority that we won at the last election. It was on the votes of people who've had enough of the orthodoxy that we can drive the nation's prosperity from the southeast and redistribute some of the fruits in the form of welfare payments, public service support to the places that aren't contributing to the economic growth in the way that the southeast is. This is a deeply wrong model. And rather than redistribution, we want equal contribution. We want every part of the country to be contributing to prosperity, as of course they can, should, and want to. And the agenda here, and what levelling up means, is a focus on the roots of prosperity, which is not, so it's not just about redistribution, and nor, by the way, much as our debates focus on these things, and I understand why, it's very much, we're not just focusing on the big infrastructure investments that are badly needed. Talking about rail today, for instance, but there's all the focus on broadband, connectivity of all sorts, which is absolutely foundational to prosperity anywhere and to levelling up. But crucially, and I think particularly relevant to the mission of Big Tent, it's about the social foundations of prosperity and what we might call the social infrastructure that places need and that are the real roots of well-being in a place. So we want to make sure that places can fulfill their identity, their pride of place, develop the local skills base, and once again be the towns that attract capital. And government has a big role to play in that, but ultimately it will be driven by the private sector and crucially by civil society.
I mean, from what I can tell, I was at one of the sessions earlier on, and if you look at the range of the things that has been discussed this afternoon, there are experts in this room on every aspect of what you've just referred to. I mean, your own report, it seemed to me to really cover a huge complexity of suggestions, from quite sort of big macro suggestions like increasing the use of technology to, you know, micro ideas about how you might involve people in communities that don't normally get involved with local government, and a lot of the things that have been discussed here today. But I mean, I do have to ask you a political question, given what's happened today with HS2 and the Northern Powerhouse. Northern Powerhouse was obviously something that was championed by George Osborne. This comes back to my point really about why should people take this government seriously on this, and did your department know about that announcement? How is it going to play in your department, do you think?
Well, I mean, the announcement is a very good one. There's part of £100 billion going into rail, and very significant improvements in the connectivity of northern towns. The decision that was made not to proceed with the plan that had been previously expected was on the basis of the fact that it was a 10-year-old plan and it would take 20 years to deliver. So what the government's doing is investing immediately in much faster improvements in the rail network of the north. So, I mean, I take your point. I think it's legitimate to say, we have been saying, following the plan made some years ago, originally commissioned under the coalition government. The reality has changed, as we've all become aware. The government has to think about the best use of taxpayers' money, and I think the decision has been made rightly to do the best we can and as fast as we can on the basis that the towns we're talking about need connectivity improvements immediately. But I don't think there's great value in, I mean, what a great man he is, by the way, Marvin Rees, a huge admirer. Even though he's not my party, I'm rather disappointed to hear he's not standing again as Mayor of Bristol. He made a very simple point in answer to Ben about being able to rely on long-term funding commitments, and that really is necessary. And local government in particular, given the way we've structured finance in this country, are largely dependent on, increasingly, substantially dependent on central government money. They do need certainty about the money that's available. I don't think anyone should just say, I'm going to, automatically. It's understandable that people want to see the proof is in the pudding, and we will. These investments will be made now. We now have an actual deliverable plan that is being implemented. That is what was announced today. People can have absolute confidence it's going to happen. But long term, we will have to be judged in retrospect by whether we deliver the improvements in living standards and connectivity that people elected us to deliver.
Quite. So, I mean, some of this funding will come from the private sector, and some of it will come from the redistribution of grants would otherwise have come from the EU. I mean, to what extent did you see, I don't want to get too hung up on Brexit, but obviously Brexit is the huge thing that's happened structurally since the big society sort of moved off the centre of the agenda.
Yes.
So, twofold really, to what extent for you did Brexit offer a sort of a better way to regenerate potentially, and how now do you think that can be played out? Because in the earlier session with Stephen Kinnock, and we know, I suspect that quite a lot of people in this room were not Brexiteers, that there is a sense that nothing good is going to come out of Brexit, and nothing good has come out of it.
Yes. Well, there's two immediate observations, two things that Brexit enables in this space. One is a meaningful industrial strategy. So we can reform the state aid regime so that the government can actually support industries in the regions that it wants to, rather than being confined by the EU rules on that. And the other, and we haven't yet seen the detail on how this will work, but the replacement for the EU structural funding, social funding, is the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which has been tied up in the plans for levelling up quite rightly, because it's explicitly replacing a fund that was about supporting the regions which were less prosperous. So the new system that we designed to replace the EU funding is really important and very exciting. And I think we can do better. I think we can have a better system that is more responsive and more reflective of the needs of local places. It's not done according to a algorithm in Brussels. And we can ensure that the funding supports the wider agenda that the government has around levelling up. So, and crucially, what we need, and what I think Brexit really was, whether you voted for it or not, I think most people would recognise the value of the slogan of take back control. And to my mind, we will not have delivered Brexit really unless we allow people to take back control, not just from Brussels as the country has done, but from London. And unless we are meaningfully empowering communities with agency, with a sense of control over the communities they live in, an ability to influence local decision making.
But do you think the government's really prepared to do that? Because when Michael Gove appeared in front of one of the select committees in the last few days, I mean, one, he talked a lot about spending more money on all sorts of things, money which I presume for the most part is going to be directed from the centre. And the second point was that he wasn't interested in changing the way that business rates are allocated. I mean, and that could have been a route to giving local communities more control over the money they raise, perhaps increase their own competitive status.
Well,
so,
there's
that seems to be a bit of a structural barrier.
Well, there's a great conversation to be had about business rates, and there's a review underway at the moment into that. So I think you probably didn't want to anticipate that. Certainly, the business rate regime.
I'd like to hear more about that.
So would I. But that is underway. I mean, no doubt we need to think about the way business rates work. We've got to revive towns and town centres in particular with a better business rate regime. No, I mean, I'm convinced, and Michael made a speech in our party conference in Manchester, which was about enabling places to take back control. His vision of levelling up is explicitly about empowering communities. There is no single blueprint that can be imposed from above about how to support places. Paul Collier, I don't know if you guys have engaged, if Radix and Big Tent have had much to do with Paul, but I mean, he's absolute, George is nodding, he's the doyen of this agenda, and his vision is, his point he always makes is, there's radical uncertainty about what works when it comes to levelling up or local growth or whatever we call it. We do not know what a particular town requires, and if any of us sitting in London were to say what Huddersfield needs is this, what Gateshead needs is that, it would be outrageous. We've got prosperity's got to be driven from the place that needs it, and so Shared Prosperity Fund is a means by which we can empower places with funding that is national, but the power needs to be in the hands of those communities themselves, partnership of local government.
But who will make the decision on how those funds
are
allocated? That's really where the localism
absolutely, where does power reside?
Yeah.
This is our great question. Where does power reside? And there has to be accountability. We have to mitigate against abuse and dysfunction. But there needs to be, in my view, and I'm sure in the government's view, a real commitment to empowering local decision makers, and that is, to my mind, a partnership of local government, of the local business community, civil society, and ordinary people themselves who can be empowered. I think we are laggards in development of democracy. having been the forerunners in democratic innovation 100 years ago, we are now behind many other countries who do a lot better about how to engage people in decision making. So the significant ministers here who can help on that topic, but there are ways to involve people in decision making that I think could be very exciting in this century. Yeah,
and I think we should explore that a little bit. I mean, the government before the reshuffle was talking about reviewing local government and perhaps I hesitate to use the word restructuring, but making some reforms to local government. And it strikes me that certainly, under the coalition government, there was a lot of talk about localism. How can you reconcile some of the contradictions that seem to come out of that agenda now, in that clearly there's been a lot of devolution, but if you devolve power to more directly elected mayors, and at the same time you're talking about bringing in sort of citizens' assemblies, potentially you've got a pressure on local government accountability, both from above and below.
Yes.
And I can see that could become quite complicated in terms of, where local people feel they should actually engage.
Yes. Well, you put your finger on a lot of the tensions. I mean, I should emphasise, I'm speaking for myself, not for the government. I'm not a minister, I don't speak for the government. But in the report I wrote, at the request of the government last year, when we were going through this extraordinary kind of social and cultural moment of everybody being, working from home or furloughed, and suddenly having a role, stepping up and playing a very significant role in local communities in a way that many people hadn't before. I think we saw the power of people to take responsibility and to support their neighbours. And I think we need to build on that, and that's what I was writing about. And I think we've discovered an enormous latent reservoir of power in our communities. And we cannot think, in my view, that the only agency which should have any authority or responsibility in a place is the local councils as they're currently constituted. So I'd like to see us invigorate local government, but also to empower ordinary people and civil society. So how it's to be done is the great question for us all. I think we need a big conversation about where power resides and how to properly organise it. You do need accountability, ultimately, through the ballot box. That's the only real source of sovereignty that we have, and decisions have to be made that are consistent with the democratic mandates, which is why government itself, central government, needs to always keep an oversight.
But will central government be prepared to sort of take risks? Because, you know, part of the localism agenda did see power being transferred to sort of below the local government level in terms of how schools were being run,
Yes.
Local health authorities. It was quite radical in many ways. And yet at the same time, there was a complete squeamishness about this concept of the postcode lottery.
Yes.
I mean, if you can't allow things to fail in certain areas or to have different strengths and weaknesses, then how do you actually, you know, achieve excellence in practice?
Well, many people here will have a very good insight into that, I think. I mean, I would like to recover the energy of the big society, those early days of the coalition government, when there was a huge drive to empower communities and to innovate and to reform public services in a way that put power in the hands of people, frontline professionals and the users of services and local communities. It's fair to say, I think, that the public service reform agenda has been distracted over the last 5 years by other events. So now it would be good to get back to some of that reforming spirit.
I'm being waved at. Sorry, I asked you a question that required a longer answer, but I'm being waved at to wrap things up. And before we do end, I do want to ask you about housing, which seems to be so critical to regeneration. And this is a genuine question. When I was reading some of the things that you've written, I came across some really interesting stuff about trying to sort of break down the, my word, not yours, cartel of the big developers, and what you called direct funding into social housing. Can you just briefly tell us what you meant by direct funding? Because it sounds like we could be going back to local authorities.
Well, I think we do.
Housing.
I mean, put this again. This is me personally. In Wiltshire MP, we do need more social housing. We need publicly funded social housing, and we're getting it. I mean, this is happening all over the place. In Wiltshire, we're building council housing. Old-fashioned council housing is being built. I think that. I mean, I'll be quick for Ben's sake. This is me speaking. I think the government like it too. Community land trusts, which are community-owned developments that take the price of the land out of the price of the house. So they make housing affordable, but they are private sector, they're led by it's private capital, but they are owned by and accountable to local community groups. And this is the way I think to drive the housing, part of the way, there's many other ways as well, but this is a crucial element. In rural areas, in urban areas, this is the sort of housing that people like, because it is accountable to and owned by the community. So I think we can have the housing, big housing numbers that we need, increase in supply, without the resistance that naturally we come if we only expect the big volume house builders who don't frankly care about the community or the look and feel of a house or its appropriateness to a place. If we empower communities themselves, I think we'll get the housing we need.
That seems to be a very positive point at which to end. I've got a lot of other things I'd like to ask you, but maybe for another session.
Thank you.